on various methods related to quantitative and qualitative research. Hope you all had a wonderful weekend. I know it was Super Bowl weekend, so hopefully your team won. It was Denver Broncos. So congratulations to the Denver Broncos and Peyton Manning and the whole team. So, and let's see, we will be again covering methodology and again looking at quantitative and qualitative methods. I have the mic rights off at this time because we have again a large number of participants, of course, just to minimize any background noise. And if you have any audio issues, it's recommended that you can log off and log back on. Generally that works. And my colleagues and I will be monitoring the chat pod as well. Okay, again, I'd like to welcome my colleagues as well, Dr. Keith Lerick, Dr. Mary Lou Ryder, Dr. Pat White, Dr. Tammy Capolino, and Dr. Len Hightower. So welcome, welcome everybody. Okay, so we'll be looking at anticipated methodology, looking at quantitative and qualitative research, showing you some examples, looking at purpose statements, research questions in terms of alignment with your method, some data collection, types of data, limitations, and samples. This webinar will help you a lot with your 4.1 assignment, the anticipated methodology, kind of give you an idea of the types of data you may be working with relative to your studies, and kind of tying that into again, what type of design you'll be working with, whether you're doing mixed methods, quant or qualitative methods. So again, feel free to post any questions into the chat pod, and we will be monitoring that. And also, if you again want to raise your hand, that's fine as well. Okay, let's get started with anticipated methodology. So as I mentioned before, with methodology, we're looking at what we call research design, and that's really kind of giving us the framework from which we're going to, again, engage in data collection, and also how this data will be presented later on. Once you've collected your data, you've analyzed it, everything will fall into what we call a research design. So some examples, some of your studies may be descriptive in nature, in terms of you're describing, again, the nature of the variables that you have. You might describe that data, again, qualitatively in terms of narrative, so forth, or quantitatively as well in terms of averages, percentages, so forth. Correlational is, again, relationships between variables. There's also experimental method. There's mixed methods, which is a combination of qualitative and quantitative. Of course, there's action research and many other designs. Again, in your methodology courses in the Macmillan-Schumacher, it gives you a lot of different examples. And what I'm going to be covering, for my end, I'll be covering the quantitatives, just some more practical and the most used in terms of the quantitative designs. And again, we'll be looking at mixed method, and then my colleague, Dr. Jeff Lee, will be looking at qualitative methods, showing you some examples of that. Again, the other important part of this has to do with population and sample of your study. Of course, the population is your group, the primary group of interest in terms of in which the research would take place, and then the idea of that the results from those samples, again, generalize out to the larger population and so forth. So let's look at quantitative research designs. The first table I'll be looking at, just giving you some examples of kind of separating out the experimental from the non-experimental. I'm only going to be presenting on the non-experimental side, given, again, the types of dissertations that we've been seeing and the types of studies that many of you are pursuing. We're going to be more so on the non-experimental side, largely descriptive, comparative, or correlational in terms of any quant or even mixed method studies. So I'm going to really just be focusing on those three areas. Not going to not going to even touch experimental at this point. Again, I just want to focus on those three areas. And again, in terms of quantitative research methods, research design, quantitative really just falls into three main categories. You're either doing descriptive, what we call domains, descriptive, comparative, or relational. Those are largely the three overarching domains that relate to quantitative research. So again, with causal comparative, this is a type of descriptive design. This is with existing data. When it says here conditions that already exist, that means that we already have an existing body of data. This could be test scores, it could be any types of archival data that we may have, and we may want to do some comparing groups. And what's referred to as the treatment variable, that's what we call the independent variable, because that is the variable that may have some type of impact on the measurement that we're doing, on the quantitative measurement that we're doing. Again, something like teaching method or instructional strategies, as an example, could be an independent variable that could again impact student performance as measured by some type of test. So the researcher looks at differences between groups. That's really largely what we're looking at here. And again, there's no experiment, there's no intervention like we would see in an experimental approach. Experimental approach is a little more, again, what we look at would be something like manipulation of variables. We're manipulating the setting, we're manipulating how the being presented to participants. So again, with causal comparative, it's really the conditions that already exist. So let me just show you an example. This is kind of framed within the sure. Please type in if you don't. If uh, if the audio, I saw somebody making a comment. So again, we just take the information and we run it through a statistical program, and then we just run it. I'm not trying to go into heavy detail on this right now. I just want to show you what it would look like. You could set up tables with your data. You run your data, you analyze it, you make some inferences based on those comparisons. So I'm not going to go into detail on the stats on this. Don't want to bore you with the stats right now. And again, I just assess the information based on the results, t-score and p-value, and I say, does this tell me that there's a difference between the groups? And based on this data, I know that there's a difference, a statistical difference between the groups. Again, not going to get heavy into the stats part. I know you guys love stats. You want me to spend another hour on stats. I know you do, but not going to do it. Want to conserve time. So p-value just basically it's really, the p-value is essentially, it's the probability that the null hypothesis is true. It's really, that's what it is. So you go in saying there's a 5% chance that there's no difference between the groups, and then you run your stats and you get a new p-value based on the calculations, and it says, oh, it's actually less than 0.05. So now in this case, there's a 0.0074 chance that the null is in fact true, and that's really how we would interpret that. So we have significance, very low p-value. You want your p-values to be very, very low and to establish statistical significance. So then a z-test, in this case, if I'm now comparing a sample to a larger population, I don't have two small groups as an example, I would then run a z-test. Again, I'd have 30 or more in my sample. I would run my stats, determine my cutoff values. I'm not going to get heavy into this, but you'll see this in the PowerPoint if you want to review this part. For, again, my stats lovers out there. And again, I would just compare this on some type of what we call cutoff values. I know I would need a stat that's greater than 1.96 or less than negative 1.96, and I would say, yes, there's a difference between the sample and the larger population. I'd run my stats, I'd look at my p-values, my z result, and say, yes, there is a difference. So then non-experimental, now we're getting into, again, there's no manipulation or control, but in this case I'm going to show you just two different examples. One is using correlation, and the other one's just more what we call descriptive. I wanted to cover descriptive, correlation, on comparative for all of you, just to kind of hit those three domains that I mentioned in the beginning. So again, We will rely here on interpretation, observation of the interactions, again, in terms of the variables. In non-experimental, we're looking at things like correlations, again, survey data. So I know a lot of you will be using things like numeric surveys. You can run correlations on that information. Yeah, stats professional will be fine. Again, I'm also here to help you out too with that. I kind of love that, love working with numbers, so that's my nerdy side. So again, descriptive. So non-experimental, again, this is just an example here saying half of North Carolina's public and charter schools received a C grade under the state's new school report card. Again, this is just an excerpt that I had pulled. Results, and again, this is just descriptive data. So it's 2,424 of the state's 2,565 public and charter schools showed 41% received. Again, all descriptive data. All we're presenting here is percentages based on this school report card. So this is an example of how you would present the descriptive data in terms of numbers, averages, percentages, so forth. So now looking at correlational, here we're looking at numbers to numbers. I always call this kind of my numbers to numbers in terms of seeing what is the relationship between the numbers. And correlation is, of course, non-experimental. We already have existing data. We crunch those numbers together and we see if there's any relationship on one variable to another. So correlate sort of a purpose statement. In terms of a purpose statement, we'd say something like, the purpose of this correlational study is to determine the relationship between leadership practices used by product development project managers and project performance. Again, with these two variables here, if this is going to be truly a correlation in the purest sense, I ask, okay, what are the numbers? And then we want to say, this would be, some kind of survey data, maybe a Likert scale that we have, and then how is project performance being measured? And we would rather look at those metrics. So if you have truly a correlational study, you got to think metrics. What metrics do I have for my two variables that I'm trying to establish a relationship on? Very, very important. Sometimes students present with me a lot of more, talk in qualitative terms about relationships. Again, that's not in the pure sense of a correlational study as it relates to a quantitative method. So you've got to keep those things in mind as you're thinking through your study if you truly have a correlation in that sense. So again, what is the relationship between 52 leadership practices used by North American automotive product development project managers as measured by, here we go, LPI and the project manager's performance scores. So here we have a measurement instrument, quantitative, and performance scores, quantitative. This is truly a correlational study, and it's asking for what is the relationship, or it's asking that question about what is
Okay, good evening, everyone. How are we doing? Let's give Dr. Guzman a big hand, and boy, I wish you would be able to, Dr. Guzman, sing us a song too. You're a fantastic singer. Brings back memories of immersion. So, okay, so we're going to transition into qualitative research, and I just wanted to start off and say that I came across an inspirational quote this week that I wanted to share, and it says, it's actually from Babe Ruth, who, as you know, is a very famous baseball player, and he says, "Every strike brings me closer to the next home run." And I think that's really true because, the more we practice, the more feedback we get, the more we take a swing at that ball coming at us, the quicker we get to hitting that next home run. I think, you're probably feeling a lot of that right now, getting feedback from your professors, also getting some feedback from your peers in office hours and such. And so I think I just want to set that tone tonight and say, the more feedback you get, it's all of our attempts as a community, if you will, to help you hit that next big home run. And you're in the presence of some very veteran professors here, and we very meticulously, pick the professors, design the course with your best interest in mind. And so we want you to know that we're behind you 100%, and let's continue to work at this prospectus paper so that you can really hit it out of the ballpark. Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about qualitative research, and this is not an exhaustive effort to reteach 754 and 755, but rather this is highlighting some important components of the class, but also to help you align some of these important concepts from the class to currently 790, but also down the road, Chapter 3 of your dissertation. And you may not have known it at the time, and you probably still don't, but we spent a lot of time aligning these things so that the transition from research methods courses to 790 and then eventually to your Chapter 3 of your dissertation hopefully is as seamless as possible. Okay, so let's explore qualitative research a little bit deeper. So qualitative research is oriented in the social and behavioral sciences, sociology, anthropology, psychology. It's more descriptive in nature and less predictive in nature. And so I think, one of the first questions you need to ask yourself is, what is the nature of your study? Is it quantitative in nature or is it qualitative in nature? Are you trying to describe something or are you trying to predict something? And usually having that kind of a discussion helps you point towards the right general methodology, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. So for qualitative research, data comes from 3 different types of data. You've got interviews, observations, and examination of artifacts. And within interviews, there are many, many famous books just written about interviews. And so if you decide to, down the road, pick qualitative research as your method, then I would suggest looking up books. Rubin has a really good book on the art of hearing data. There are also good books on designing high-quality interview questions. But when I think about interview, I think about some of the seasoned interviewers on TV, CNN, 60 Minutes, 2020. And so I always go back to this idea that I've just always been fascinated with. How does somebody like Connie Chung get the respondent to say that, whatever that is? And that is oftentimes the good data. And I love how Dr. White explains this. She calls it the juicy data. So how does an interviewer get the respondents to share the juicy data? And there's an art to that, okay? Observations, what can you observe to get at that same data? And also examination of artifacts. What kind of artifacts can you examine? Meeting minutes, training material, job descriptions. So all those working types of data working together strengthens the rigor of your data. And here we talk about things like reliability and triangulation of data. So you want to have these things in mind because what kind of data you get sometimes is also very influential in picking the appropriate methodology for your study. I want to go over just a few of the more popular research methods. Patton calls them traditions. Ethnography, which looks at the culture of a group of people. A phenomenological study. Phenomenology looks at the lived experience of a phenomenon for a group of people. Ecological studies look at interactions within an ecology or an environment. Grounded theory looks at what theories emerge from a systematic analysis of data. Case studies look at specific cases, and cases can be determined by some kind of unit of analysis, right? And really the place to go is page 97 through 99 of your Patton book, and there are 16 of the more popular qualitative research methods, or as Patton calls them, traditions. Once you identify, 3 potential ones, you want to go to the subsequent pages. So it's like 100 through, the next 20, 25 pages or so. And what Patton does in the subsequent pages is he goes into a much deeper discussion on each of these methods. So once you identify 3 potential methods, go to the subsequent sections to talk about what these methods are trying to do, and out of that kind of a discussion, hopefully one method emerges as the most appropriate method for your study. And I like that term, emerges as the most appropriate, because there might be multiple ways to do it, but one really becomes the most appropriate. Okay, and I think, again, if you need feedback, you got your classmates, people in your cohort, people in your classes, as well as your instructors. And your instructors, boy, they have a lot of experience chairing dissertations, being on committees, and they can guide you through this kind of an analysis as to what's the most appropriate method. It's also important to consider the limitations of doing qualitative research. Access can potentially be limited, and data is case-specific and not always generalizable. It's oftentimes the case that when you do qualitative research, it may be locally generalizable, but may not be globally generalizable, and that's okay for the most part. And that's the nature of doing qualitative research. If you're interested in generalizability, then you perhaps need to consider a quantitative study or a mixed method study. Okay. This last one is one that we actually spent a lot of time with you on in 754. Data is gathered through the lens of the researcher, so therefore the researcher is the instrument of the study. And so we worked a lot with you on this idea of research bias, and the need for experts to guide you through this process, expert panels to look at your interview questions, the need for intercoder reliability, coding your data with somebody else so that the coding is done correctly. But I think my suggestion to you here is that you turn a weakness into a strength. You turn a limitation into a strength. So be transparent, identify some potential limitations, and really have protocols built into your Chapter 3 methodology so that you can address these limitations. Okay? I'm going to pause here and just ask in the chat box if there are any questions so far. Questions, yes or no? Okay. And I see Tanya has a question. What's the difference between limitation and a confounding variable? Can you elaborate on that a little bit more, Tanya? And while Tanya's typing, I'll just say that usually limitations, in the midst of this. Usually limitations are things like access to entry, you're an outsider, not an insider. Yeah, I'm not sure that that terminology is associated with limitations. Maybe Dr. Larrick, Dr. DeVore, Dr. Hightower, if you guys had some experience with that term, feel free to chime in. But usually limitations are things like you're an outsider, so how do you acculturate to the localized culture to have an accurate lens? How do you limit your biases and things like that? So I think that's a term that's not used in limitations. I'm going to go on, but Tanya, we can probably guide you a little bit better once I read up on the connection between that and limitations. You need to be familiar with these three terms: delimitations, population size, and sample size. Delimitations refer to the how the researcher has narrowed the scope of the study. Emphasis on how. How are you getting down to the scope of your study? Population is the big N. The big N refers to the people of interest of your study. And then the sample, which is the little n, looks at the individuals who will participate in your study. So having a good understanding of who might participate in your study sometimes also influences what method you choose. Okay? So there's some language in the core aesthetic glans that talks about, I believe, population and size. So you do want to reflect a little bit on that in your prospectus paper. So how do you decide? So sometimes it's very clear. So some research questions are inherently lend themselves to be more quantitative. So an example would be, what is the impact of violent crime on the U.S. economy? So you've got two variables and you're looking at relationships between variables. On the other hand, some tend to be more qualitative in nature. What are the emotional impacts of violent crimes on at-risk healthcare workers? And then in some cases, a combination of quantitative and qualitative studies are necessary, or methods are necessary, and so therefore a mixed method approach is appropriate. And this is why crafting the purpose statement of your study is so impactful. Any little movement in the purpose statement has profound impacts on everything else. And this part of the presentation really refers to how you're crafting the language of your purpose statement. And so I would just recommend to you, start with the end in mind. Know what you want to accomplish at the end so that you have a clear vision on the path it takes to get there. I'm seeing a lot of discussion in the chat box. Give me just 1 second to monitor this. Okay, so I think Dr. Guzman probably answered that question best. I want to take a few minutes and unpack assignment 4.1 for you. This is right out of the course at a glance. You are to write 2 to 3 pages and address some of the following things. Is your paper qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods? And then once you have identified that, what are the 2 or 3 potential methods that could be used for this study? Okay, what's your rationale for these methods? Why did you choose what you chose? What's the population? What does the sample look like? And so, again, 2 or 3 pages addressing these questions and really leveraging your textbooks from the methodology class to get that accomplished. And this is due at the end of week 6, and we are beginning week 5, so you've got about a week and a half, a little over a week and a half to get this done. But you should start planning ahead now. So I've got a couple of suggestions working with this assignment. The first is that idea of starting with the end in mind. Ask yourself, in order to answer this research question, what does the answer to your research question look like? So never mind the whole dissertation thing. Just go straight to the end and talk it through. Talk it out loud. Answer your research question based on what you know. And is that answer kind of what you're looking for? Because if it's not, then you may go back to the wording and the organization of the research question and the purpose statement. And so working with the end in mind talks about this alignment issue. Where will the answers come from? So after you code the answers for themes, where's the answers coming from? Is it all interviews? Is it interviewing parents and children? Is it interviewing CEOs as well as their subordinates? Is it observations? Is it examination of artifacts? Where's that data coming from? And out of those considerations, what's the most appropriate method you can choose to achieve that end result? I like this slide. This took a while to mock up because the Adobe interface mixes up the arrows and stuff. So let's take a look. When you work with the end in mind, it's this idea that as you work through these different steps, that you have perfect alignment in terms of language, in terms of the scope of what you're trying to do, the overarching objective of what you're trying to do, that it's aligned from all the way from, you know, the intro, the background, the purpose statement, research question, all the way down to how you answer the question. And what I find a lot of times is I find that answers to research questions sometimes are misaligned and they don't fully answer the research question. And so you want to just really keep an eye out for that and make sure that you have some alignment between the purpose statement and the research question all the way down to how you answer it. The themes is really important. I would even ask some experts in the field and say, if you were to answer this question, what might be some potential themes that might emerge from the data? And if those themes are totally out of whack with what you're thinking about, then you may need to go back to drawing boards and redesign some aspects of your purpose statement and research question. Okay. All right. Suggestion 2, build on your previous learning. So we actually intentionally built 754, 55 to have some assignments aligned to this methodology assignment. And if you remember back in 754, we had you examine a chapter 3 of a dissertation and to identify an alternate research methods. So essentially what you're doing here in the 790 paper is coming up with 3 potential methods, and hopefully one will emerge as the most appropriate method. But the skill set to do that, you've already practiced before back in 754. So you may want to look back at your 754 papers and re-engage with some of what you did there, because you might have identified some potential methods that can parallel what you're trying to do here. So again, look at 754, the Analyzing Chapter 3 assignment. So suggestion number 3 is to pay close attention to the actual methods. Okay, and I'll just do that through an example. So the key to doing a phenomenological study is to look at the experiences of a group of people through a phenomenon. And if you take away that phenomenon, then what you end up having is an ethnographic study. So we have, I believe it's an alpha student that Dr. Ryder is working with. She's looking at female California Highway Patrol officers, how I want to say something like 12% of female officers are uniformed officers. So that already begins to emerge as a phenomenological study, because 12%, why is it 12%, why not more? But in talking to her, she said, is my audio cutting out too? Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. So in talking to her, the student said, well, it's 12% at the entry level, but when you get to middle management, the phenomenon is that over 30% of middle management officers are female. So there's a secondary phenomenon where it almost triples in size by the time they get to middle level management. So, sometimes by looking at the population in the sample, there begins to emerge this idea of what is the most appropriate method. And without that phenomenon, if you just look at California Highway Patrol officers, then that would be an ethnographic study. But once you start looking at what is really happening with this unique 12%, and how does that 12% become 30% once you get to that next level, and that begins to point at a phenomenological study. Okay, so there's some of our sources, and we've got time for questions and answers. So let me pause here and just monitor the chat box. We've got some time for question and answers.
About pragmatism, and Dr. Lyric and I addressed it. Okay. And I said the example of like grounded theory as an example, because really pragmatism is really a paradigm. It's not a method. It's a paradigm. So I don't know if you want to shed light on that.
I saw that. I think you guys did a great job with that. I see a question on Barbara's question on grounded theory. So grounded theory is actually done a little bit differently. If you're interested in doing grounded theory, there's a good book by Sharmaz called Constructing Grounded Theory. And in grounded theory studies, what you're trying to do is come up with a theory that is universally generalizable, right? So this is one of those rare exceptions where we're taking a quantitative approach, meaning, a large N, and you're going to always yield the same result. I think of grounded theory as one of the, I guess, more difficult theories to work with, in the sense that it's a lot to pull off a theory. However, that said, it's one that I always aspire to, because if you can come up with a theory, then boy, you can retire early, write books, and really impact lots of people's lives, right? So how can you work with all of your data, and out of that data emerges a theory that's universally applicable? The Sharman's book is really good, and she talks about deep interviews, multiple rounds of interviews, and so the actual methodology for grounded theory actually is going to be slightly different, whereas you have interview questions that have to be approved before IRB. Grounded theory studies actually has this iterative process of designing new interview questions. So the methodology part of it is a little bit different than your traditional qualitative study. But check out that Kathy Sharman's book called Constructing Grounded Theory if you're interested. So I'll let Dr. Guzman answer Kelly's question on pragmatism, since you're heavy into that discussion. And let me work with Muwafiq's question. Does data triangulation require the three elements, interview, observation, artifacts, to be used, or two are sufficient, interviews and artifacts? Yeah, that's a good question. So it's not formulaic in that way, Muwafiq. What you should do is consider more types of data. So just because you have interviews, it doesn't end there. So are you interviewing different groups of people, right? And different groups of people might give you different perspectives. I'll give you an example. I did a study that looked at gender tensions within a Nepali village, and men have more rights than women. Well, if I only interviewed the elder men, I would get a very skewed perspective. But once I interviewed the women, the girls, the boys, the grandmas and grandpas, now I'm painting a fuller picture. So again, it's not a formulaic answer as to how many or what type, but rather the more you can have, the better. And Dr. Hightower says 3 different types of people who share the experience. So I would say, yeah, if you can get at least 3 different types of people. Age also is an indicator. So do older people experience it differently than younger people, males and females? If it's culturally specific, you might want to look at different cultures as well. So really, triangulation is nothing more than looking at data from multiple points, trying to make sure that what you're seeing is the true story that's really happening on the ground. Okay? All right, any other questions? So we'll stick around a little bit longer and help with specific questions, but I want to circle back to the comment I made first tonight, and that is, the quote by Babe Ruth, "Every strike brings me closer to the next home run." And we have your best interest at heart, and we're going to continue to give you feedback and guide you through this process. Your classmates, your colleagues are going to give you feedback, and really it's to help you finish the 790 class with a paper that is strong, a paper that you're proud of, and a paper that hopefully can transition very nicely into chapter 1 of your dissertation. Okay? So have a wonderful rest of the evening, and I think some of you are breaking out to your instructors' offices, and others are joining them later during the week. So thank you again for your time tonight, and let's continue to work at it and finish the semester out strong.